Sokal wanted to show that the humanities are suffering from an increasing loss of reality and have little to do with the real world. Sokal believed that a postmodernism in which only subjective interests and perspectives count is the most evil manifestation of the anti-intellectualism currently circulating, because it suppresses the idea that facts and evidence are important. For Sokal, there is a real world. Their attributes are not simply constructions. This is how someone who is convinced of a one and only consciousness for all people speaks, and therefore believes that he can be dismayed by the spread of subjectivist thinking. That agreements are important is not disputed even in a subjectivism. The practical value of an agreement on the probability of regularities is beyond question. But the assertion of a general natural law belongs in regulatory policy, and not in objective knowledge. Sokal speaks of evidence that is important, but in doing so he uses a concept of value that cannot be logically justified as an objective one. Something is important for a specific purpose, and there is no more an objective purpose than there is an objective interest. A practically useful predictable regularity is something totally different from the logical universality of a proof that confirms a natural law that does not depend on conditions. What is meaningful or purposeful for one person does not have to be so for the other. The neutral attributes of real things should be rejected, because only the important properties are important. Everything else is abstracted from. It must always be clear that attributes that things have can only be spoken of in a pragmatic sense, because the things themselves are not colored. The color is in the brain. Importance is already a perspective. There is no universal importance, not even that of surviving, and that's a good thing, because otherwise there would be no more freedom and no independent, subjective thinking. The simple existence of a stone that someone trips over is often taken as evidence of a reality that is independent of the individual. It is said that this stone is beyond subjective discretion. But that is not the case at all. It's up to me whether something escapes my attention or not. In this case, the stone resistance is only possible if I don't simply step over the stone. This requires my will to want to go my own way undisturbed. For someone who likes to stumble over things because they find it funny, for example, such resistance is completely irrelevant. It takes a will that aims at something in order for anything to be considered an obstacle. There is no such thing as an objective obstacle. There needs to be an individual will, an intention. And where this is not present, there is no obstacle. However, intentions are not necessarily universal. Realists never tire of presenting simple, natural and self-evident examples, such as water that wets, fire that burns, snow that is white, whether you know it or not, and regardless of the language in which you talk about it. But this is nothing but habit, agreement, and the practical use that brings about these attributes, because what water or fire or snow itself is cannot be determined independently of consciousness. Basic agreements are needed on how something is to be understood, and that is also the reason why ultimate justifications are not possible. Maurizio Ferrari, Italy's spokesman for neo-realism, wants to see the world again as is itself without consciousness. He also believes that the adoption of objective truths is the reason that the only chance for emancipation from oppression is lost, because one falls in line with the powerful. Because there is no longer a universal truth in the world that can oppose against the mighty power. According to Ferrari, without scientific realism, mankind will become a useful idiot for all the dictators worldwide. However, the adherence to incommensurability remains a merit that makes him and Derrida, but also Adorno, brothers in arms, including the mystics and language critics of all times, for whom the logical identifiability of things is and remains a stupidity. These are landmarks on the path of intellectual progress that have once again been deeply analyzed, and one can only hope that they do not disappear into obscurity again so quickly. Despite all realistic deceptions and seducers, reality, as it is, does not exist and cannot exist. Just as there is no way to things themselves, which was Husserl's slogan at the beginning of the 20th century. There are very specific power interests that fuel realism and logical absolutism. Where Nietzsche feared that one would not be able to get rid of God if one still believed in grammar, one could also say the same thing about objective reality. That one cannot get rid of God if one still believes in an objective reality. The superstities in a higher, not man-made authority, whose name for thousands of years was God, and which now bears the name universally valid logic, was actually supposed to be put to an end by postmodernism, which has partly succeeded, but just at the price that the child is thrown out with the bathwater and reason is no longer possible at all. Modernity has brought a new creed, namely the universality of logic, rationality and reason. All education and forming was now geared towards the new to anchor religious replacement in the people. From now on, the general, the majority and the uniform should ensure law and order in the democratic state. This quantifying view of things, raised to normality, was granted the right to marginalize those who don't conform to discipline where the unity of thought was in danger. There could only be one truth, just as only one reality was possible, and everyone had to follow the rules of this truth and reality. Nietzsche was the turning point away from Hegel and Kant, both of whom dominated the intellectual landscape in Germany in the mid-19th century. With Nietzsche, it became clear to an ever-growing audience how rationality, logic, reason and truth were instrumentalized as tools of power. About 100 years later, Nietzsche criticized the generalization mania of his time, and its system thinking were then viewed by thinkers like Derrida, Lyotard, Bourdieu and Foucault as the beginning of a sign theory that was just waiting to be worked out even more clearly by them. In postmodernism, saying goodbye to uniformity thinking means liberation from many uniformizing constraints. For Lyotard, facade of unity is nothing but a strategy of domination. He considers the desire for wholeness to be the disease of modernity, an obsession and a path to totalitarianism and terror. Lyotard claims to have seen through the deception of wholeness and therefore wants the complete dissolution of overarching structures. For Lyotard, reason corrupted by a formal striving for unity for the sake of unity is nothing other than an illegitimate striving for power and domination. The belief that there is a scientifically provable reality filled the masses with hope for a harmony that can now replace the divine order. David Hume made it clear a few decades before Kant that the law of cause and effect is primarily a habit of thought. But if someone is used to believing from an early age that there is a reason for everything and that every event has a cause, then the mind has a hard time combating such habits. It would take a higher level of education, which is not available to everyone, to understand that the causal law explains nothing because you only ever know that A follows B, but not if and why there is a necessity. In fact, there are many effects for which no plausible and sole cause, can be determined. The belief That every effect must also have a cause is more of a naive childish belief that is deeply rooted as rationalism. Arthur Trubich once called causality a thinking drive toward unity. These widespread and natural thinking habits also include generalizing from individual experiences. All it takes is for the same event to occur 2 or 3 times for it to be naively assumed that continuous regularity can be expected. Nietzsche explains it like this. Even in the early days of human history, it was necessary to react as quickly as feasible to possible dangers, which ultimately led to this habit of generalization and the belief that everything repeats itself. The rule of the general begins with the observation of sameness and similarity among the hunters of the Stone Age, who identified a movement in the bush as coming from a predator. This was based on experience. The principle of generalization, which can also be understood as a principle of differentiation, leads people with bad experiences, i.e., those who have had their expectations disappointed when dealing with things, to become more suspicious of a possible repetition. People with good experiences tend to expect their hopes to be fulfilled. For Lyotard, general concepts are in most cases the result of optimism, that is, the belief that one's own concepts of the world are not very different from the concepts of others, so that nothing stands in the way of communication based on rational logic. You just have to stick to the usual commercial conventions. The principle of generality, that is, generalization, and universalization, is essential for the constitution of any order, whether scientific or political. Generality comes about by disregarding the special circumstances, in science as well as in politics. It means a principal subordination of the individual or the single case. And this principle works by accepting the priority of society everywhere that is spoken and written. Whether as natural law or criminal law, the rule of the general is effective. Lyotard and Derrida now respond to this omnipotence of the law with a completely different view of human thought. For them, the ability to think is nothing other than the disempowerment of the logical universality of concepts. Derrida calls this disempowerment deconstruction. But because Lyotard does not distinguish between logical incommensurability and mere heterogeneity, there is also no distinction between logical incompatibility and practical usefulness. So that general terms are overall and generally condemned, even if they are useful. Without the use of abstractions as a useful collective name, where details are admittedly unproblematic in a particular context and can therefore be abstracted from them, intellectual work would be far too cumbersome and laborious. However, such an economy of thought only works if the terms are not given a dubious meaning, which then leads to a wide variety of misunderstandings. Individual arbitrariness is the decisive factor in the formation of concepts and where the respective interest behind it is clearly expressed. You also know where you stand. However, when assuming objectivistic is as it is states, the individual and its conception of importance and significance play no role. Such a de-individualization also takes place in Lyotard and Derrida, because neither of them has really said goodbye to the ontologic being yet. Because both overestimate the intrinsic dynamics of language and place the grammar of words above thinking. In fact, people are thought by language. They just believe they can think for themselves. This strange objectivism does not really fit into the postmodern scheme, if one even wants to claim one. The whole thing becomes even more strange when Lyotard demands that we fight against the power of general concepts, at the risk of life, but then you have to allow yourself to be terrorized by language. His demonization of general concepts does not prevent Lyotard from talking about a nature of the postmodern people. Just as Derrida also knows an essence of understanding. No matter how much Foucault can proclaim that things have no essence. It is precisely from such natures, or normalities, that the lamented exclusion of minorities and the unnaturalness, as a deviation from society's general views arises. Someone who accuses the universalists of suppressing cultural differences and describes the universal as the false absolute, should not speak of any natures, or any essence. This is also not a translation error, nor of any databases that become to a nature of postmodern mankind.